Hi, welcome to Workshop 2D, Sustainable MMT, Geopolitics, Ecology, and Development. So we've talked a little bit of this, a lot about money and MMT and policy, so now this workshop wants to see how does it fit in with geopolitics and the rest of the world and development in a sustainable way.
Wait, you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'm Lara Merling.
My name is William Lawrence. I'm with a group called the Sunrise Movement. Lara and I will be the chief interrupters for the next hour and a half to keep our panelists and all of us on track, because I know we want to have the most focused and targeted discussion while also reflecting the breadth of experience that's in the room. And how we're going to format this is we have 4 esteemed panelists who are each going to get an opportunity to introduce themselves and then speak for 5 to 10 minutes each. We're going to have a little bit of a focused conversation among the panelists with an opportunity to ask questions of each other and see if we can find a thread of discussion that we can really dive deep into, and then have an opportunity to broaden that with questions and contributions from everyone else in the room, because we know there's a ton of knowledge in the room. So, yeah, and we are going to claim that title of Chief Interrupters, so in the interest of all of us being able to focus and explore these ideas together.
We can start now. We can just go in order, maybe? And,
which one? From me?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, I can contribute with providing, let's say, a general picture of the paper I wrote for this session, and this is a basically key point to me for geopolitics and the understanding of the international relation, geopolitics, and also development. I think could be actually a good start. And I wrote a paper with the title MMT Theory of Exchange Rate. And why the exchange rate is so important? Because if you understand, to me, if you understand the exchange rate, how it's determined, and which is actually the power that the market has or doesn't have on the exchange rate, and which is the role of the state in determining, you can actually better understanding which is the policy space of the state. And first of all, I need to point out that, to me, it's not a post-Keynesian paper. It's not grounded on a category that you will find in Keynes. It's actually grounded on an autonomous set of concepts which are related with the cornerstone concept by Warren Moser of currency as public monopoly. And basically, of course, the mechanism goes, as all MMT goes, by recognizing the currency as a tool designed by the state to provide himself of real resources. So it goes that the state taxes a population in a specific currency. This creates the need of this currency in the population. Therefore, it creates seller of goods and services in that specific currency, and the state then can therefore provide himself of real goods, creating its currency by spending. Okay, so this is not about exchange. The money doesn't rise from the circulation. And the key point in this story is that the state, when it spends its currency, it does provide a value to its currency. It does provide a price to its currency in terms of real goods and services. It does provide a term of exchange. In other words, it does say what the private sector should do to get the next unit of currency. So that's the origin of the value of the currency. It's not about quantity of money. It's not about, I don't know, the prestige of a currency. It's about what the state say arbitrarily that you need to do to get the next unit. Okay. For example, if tomorrow the USA will start to put a zero behind all the spending it does, well, likely the term of exchange of the dollar will decrease of 10 times. You see what I mean? I mean, it's a nominal arbitrary arbitrary setting. When, of course, then the paper actually goes a little bit further in recognizing that there is a privilege, in the access of currency within the private sector. There is, not everybody has the same access to currency. Basically you have that the state provides directly its currency just to a way smaller population than the one is under taxation. So this creates impose an arbitrage of currency within the private sector. So you have a primary supply of currency, which is the public spending, and then you have a large part of the private sector that is obliged to get the currency from other private. So, and actually the term of exchange that you have at the start is likely to increase while the currency is flowing down the private sector. So the currency does have a different term of exchange in function of where you are in the system. And the job guarantee or transitional job program is nothing more than a universal access to currency. So you are, with the job guarantee, you are actually eliminating these, this difference in the access of currency. And this is an element, by the way, of economic democracy, I think. Now, the term of exchange of the currency, the paper goes argue that there are elements in the system that create a gravitation around this, let's say, structural term of exchange of the currency, which could be understood as being measured in abstract labor. Abstract labor is a Marxian category, which is time of labor at average intensity at prevalent technique. So you can have a gravitation around this axis, which could be, for example, could be made by private trading dynamics and real competition dynamics, and then you can, there are other sets that you can find in other things that you can find in the paper. And so the important point is that this term of exchange of currency does of course have an expression also in terms of other currency. And this expression is basically, the paper argues, is basically is driven by the ratio of the term of exchange of currency between two systems that those who sell and buy currency face. And why this is important? This is important because when you understand how the system, let's say, drive structurally the term of the exchange rate, you understand that it is not the trade imbalances that are driving the exchange rate. Otherwise, the trade imbalances are actually the expression of the consequence, the outcome of a foreign net desire of save the local currency at given marginal term of exchange, at given margin. So somehow I don't see the trade imbalances as a cause, but I see as an outcome. And yes, so this I think is is a key point to really understand what a foreign constraint is. Because MMT doesn't say that there's no such a thing as foreign constraint, but what it says that there's no such a thing as foreign constraint that will prevent you to reach full employment with a floating exchange rate system. Also, the foreign constraint, what's the foreign constraint? Foreign constraint is technology. It's the fact that you depend from specific import from another country for develop qualitatively your economic structure. But this is a qualitative element. It's not a quantitative element. And trade imbalances, current account are just quantitative. They tell you anything about dependency and constraint. For example, you have Angola. Angola produces just oil. Angola produces just oil, and actually is often in surplus, in trade surplus. But Angola is completely dependent from the foreign war for everything. You have Australia that is often in deficit, but of course it's less dependent than Angola. So you cannot raise a connection between trade imbalances and dependence. So thank you. This was basically my paper and my contribution to the discussion.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself quickly?
Yes. Okay. So my name is Ivernizzi. I'm a member of MMT, which is an association that is spreading MMT in different environments in Italy, and is basically the sister association of MMT that is doing the same in Spain. I have a bachelor in economics in Bergamo, and I'm finishing my Master of Science there, and again in economics, and I'm a French if you want.
Will you make your paper available at some point?
Well, the paper actually already sent it also with a video to, I think the panelists.
To Rowan.
Okay.
Yeah, to Rowan. So yes,
Thank you.
Very different kind of tone. My name is Carla Skandier. I'm a senior research associate with the Next System project. For those not familiar, it's a project of the Democracy Collaborative, and basically what we do is that we all understand in the project that the crisis that we are facing, not only in the United States, but in the world, is systemic, and for such we need systemic solutions. My focus on climate change, so basically what we do have a proposal now that is very linked to MMT, outside of the job guarantees focus, and related to climate change. But first I want to talk to three kind of assumptions for this idea. First is the market's flawed, and it's not only flawed because fossil fuels have more subsidies, because all the institutions are actually towards into extractive mode that is preempting us to move forward to an actually sustainable, more democratic, and somewhat decentralized system, energy system. And because it's flawed against fossil fuel industries, that means that they have been holding the wealth and economic power of our society for a long time, and that has shifted since back in the days, but also recently into an oligarchy that is actually holding the political power. So the second assumption is that we are facing the greatest threat, I think, in climate change. At least that's my perspective. Others might have other things to input, but we also have the greatest opportunity. And I think people that were here yesterday, Stephanie Kelton and others, were saying how much of the movement shift after the latest financial crisis, and how the conversation actually shift. And we need to actually be crisis ready. I come from a climate perspective, but I also been digging into the problem of fossil fuel industry and the financial crisis. There's a lot of conversation now that we mark the 10 years of last year's the last financial crisis. What is going to be the next? I think every economist knows there's a next crisis always in the way. From a climate perspective, there's a lot of signs that might be in the form of financial assets under fossil fuel companies that are strained. For those who are not familiar, this is called in the environmental movement as the carbon bubble. And basically, if we are true about keeping the temperatures within the 2 Celsius, that means that huge amounts of the assets of those companies are strained already, and it in the house of the 80%. And I know that we're all thinking like, oh, but that's the fossil fuel investors. We all know what happened 10 years ago. It's not only the mortgage investors, it's also the bank. If you have a house, if you have insurance, that means your insurance is also in the line because they invest in fossil fuel industries. If you have retirement account, 401k, that means always in the line. So it's very similar to what happened. So we need to be crisis ready, not only in the climate front, but also the financial side of the crisis. And I think MMT can play a role in kind of being ready for the next crisis with the climate folks. And the third assumption, especially in the climate, is we've been talking a lot about the transition. And a lot of people talk about the transition in the sense that we need to ramp up renewables, but that also means that we need to wind down fossil fuel companies. And I think that has not been part of a lot of the debate. There's the Keep It in the Ground movement, which I think have been trying to shift the logic a little bit. The problem with the keep it in the ground message is that a lot of fossil fuel workers mean basically we are saying you need to keep it in the ground yourselves. Yeah. So the messaging has been a little tricky that way. But in the transition, I don't think companies are going to do it by themselves. It's not only a matter of regulating them to ramp that up renewables. We're going to have a high planning level that only the federal government can do it. And I know in the United States it's kind of tricky at this moment. A lot of the conversations that have been shipped to local governments because there's where the possibilities are right now, but we cannot leave behind the federal government. So what we are proposing is go hand in hand with the job guarantee, but we are looking to the wind down part of the equation, the supply side of the part of the equation. We need to stop extracting. So what we are proposing is actually called quantitative easing for the planet. Basically, we need to move away the control of private and profit-driven interests from fossil fuel reserves. And we need to do that while we are acknowledging that most of us are fossil fuel investors as well. We don't want to reward bad actors, but we need to have the full picture of what is happening. And basically, we think that the Federal Reserve can once again create money, but it's time to gain control of fossil fuel reserves. And that means buying out some of the fossil fuel companies that are not only leading us to the climate catastrophe, but also a financial catastrophe, and it's been opposing most of the climate action. So basically, this is the idea. I came from a climate background, and suddenly Kiwi, which is actually behind MMT knowledge, is giving us the answer of the question that everyone has been pushing climate action is like, how are we going to pay for this? So we pay with MMT. And I think this is of course, I think Stephanie Kelto mentioned yesterday that it does matter. It's a matter of priorities. And I think I was in another panel that question came out, like who says what we're going to do with the money? And I think the public needs to be involved. I think climate change is it's public money, public decides. It's a participatory budgeting that we're going to bring into the table, because I think we have a very paternalist view of the public, as they don't understand, so they don't have a say, but they do understand if they prefer education on climate change or safety. They do understand what they want to prioritize with so I think just ending into also a note from yesterday, we're starting to be bold, and I think if we're going to match science and politics with a climate change perspective, we need to look not only to renewables, we need to look how we're going to shift away also the power of fossil fuel industry and actually wind down. I have also a paper that I put together, not for this conference, but 2 weeks ago there was a huge conference in California for the leaders of the climate movement. Bloomberg was one of the organizers, so that was fun. I also have available here, and I look forward to talk about this. And the geopolitics, especially in climate change, I think if we're gonna talk about climate change, I know that a lot of people are moving away from the US right now, but the US is the historical 2nd emitter, the top 2nd behind China right now, so this conversation needs to keep going. 2020 is just 2 years from, not even 13 months from now, so hopefully we're going to have a very difficult political scenario there, if not within the next 3 months.
My name's Stephen Hale. I'm an economics lecturer at the University of Adelaide in South Australia. And I'm very much out of my comfort zone here because I usually talk about money and banking. I usually talk about money and banking in just about the biggest, what's the right word for it? The biggest case of environmental vandalism in the world. That's the country that I live in. We outdo the US per capita, and almost nobody outdoes the US per capita. I'm concerned. I wrote a book called Economics for Sustainable Prosperity, the first chapter of which I provided to Rohan, so I hope you had a read of it. I didn't set out to write a book really about ecological economics. I set out to compare modern monetary theory to orthodox macroeconomics. I spent nearly 20 years doing orthodox macroeconomics before I learned MMT, so I thought I was quite well placed to do that as in a mode of a reformed smoker. And, I was passionately opposed to tobacco. And so I wrote a book where I tried to build links between MMT and behavioural economics, and obviously post-Keynesian economics too, and look at some of the historical roots of modern monetary theory, and also try and explain MMT in a way which was accessible to activists as well as other economists. But while I was writing the book, I found an increasing ecological thread coming through it, because in recent years I have become more and more, well, I want to be positive about it, but actually I'm terrified about our future. The more research I do into this area, which is very different to what I spent my life thinking about, the more I'm amazed that I haven't spent more time thinking about this in the past. And I want to throw a few, I don't want to say bombs, but there's an elephant in the room on conferences like this. On that first day, the big discussions on the panels, there should be, near the beginning of the day, something which is about ecological sustainability, human survival, and modern monetary theory. Because there is nothing at all more important. It's a great conference, and I'm not offering to organise a conference, and if I did jokingly yesterday, but somebody said they wanted the conference to be in Australia, so I said, well, what about if I set one up in Adelaide? They said, no, can you do it in Sydney?
Can't please everyone.
It won't be happening. But I think there's a problem with our framing. Often there's a problem with the way I frame MMT when I discuss it. I have tried to spread modern monetary theory across the Australian Greens, with some success at the level of ordinary members of the party, but thus far no success at all with the national leadership of the Australian Greens. I haven't. Other people may have done, but I haven't. And I think that's partly my fault in terms of the way I started off framing this. When you talk about MMT to people who've not understood it before, of course you talk about what I sometimes call the axioms of MMT. I don't need to explain these to you. The idea that monetary sovereign governments face no purely financial budget constraint. We then often, on the next one, we say there's a real constraint. And we talk about labour and skills and capital equipment and technology and natural resources, but we don't mean ecological space when we talk about natural resources. And then we might go on and talk about all that great work Wayne Godley did in sectoral balances. And people can go away from that discussion with you, and they can have the wrong impression that you've been arguing for a more effective way of growing the economy. That's the way it sounds like. And that's the way it sounds. I've done that myself. I thought afterwards, I didn't do that very well. I should have started with the ecological issues, because they're the most important ones. And then it should be that MMT is, as Bill Mitchell was saying yesterday, a lens or a tool to enable you to deal more effectively with those issues, while providing everybody with the means to live a decent, productive, contented life within the means of the planet. I sometimes meet people, including at the conference last year on a panel, a great guy, but people who think that the US economy and the world economy can continue growing at its current rate forever. And the more reading that I've done, the more I've thought about it, that all these ideas are great, but we need to invest heavily in renewables. We need to do something about nitrogen and phosphorus loading. We need to do something about extinctions, have more space for wildlife. We need to deal with issues to do with water. But I genuinely don't believe, and I'm not saying this to shock, I genuinely don't believe technology has an answer for us in time. I don't think there is an answer in time, other than to consume this. And that's really difficult. I don't mean you consume less. I mean the nation has to use fewer resources and create less waste. And I genuinely believe that, let's say by 2030, you have to find a way, and this in Australia even more, we have to find a way to transition from a growing economy to an economy which is not growing anymore. And we have to do that in a way which allows for people to be fully employed and allows for people to have a better quality of life without, on average, consuming more goods and services. And that means you should have 5 weeks of holiday in this country like they do in France. You should retire early. You can certainly have decent, maternity leave, of course. You can certainly have decent healthcare. Spain has 60% of your real GDP per capita. Free healthcare system, virtually free higher education. I don't recommend their monetary system or the rate of unemployment, but you get the idea. There is enough GDP in the US already for full employment and for all these things. And the issue, which we can sometimes divert away from, because it's kind of a nasty issue, is you've got too many rich people. And we do in Australia too. It's a distribution issue. There is enough GDP for full employment or for people to have decent lives. There isn't enough with the current distribution of income and wealth. People saying the structure of the economy is changing towards services and that's going to save you. It's not. I mean, I'm involved in services, but I'm still using energy and resources. And anyway, you can't tell people how to spend their money as incomes keep rising over time. Growth is going to involve consuming more real assets. People are so enthusiastic about being able to print things themselves. That's just going to mean more consumption of materials. They talk, and this is really important because we really do need to use all the technology that's available to us to shift to renewables as quickly as we possibly can. But that's just going to mitigate the effect. I've not seen any evidence that I believe is credible. That's enough on its own. It is true that real GDP is not a pure measure of volume, and it can rise over time because of improvements in quality rather than in the quantity of what we're using up and the waste that we're generating. But if that means you can grow real GDP globally by 1% per annum, you know what? You can't have that in this country, and we can't have it in Australia. There are other countries, most countries in the world, are developing their economies in a full world, where we developed our economies in an empty world, and we have taken up the ecological space, and we have to give some of it back. And I believe that that means that even if it's possible for the way we define real GDP, or world GDP to grow, I don't think the US economy could grow for more than a few more years. I think it may have to grow in the short run to get to full employment, but you then have to find a way to organise full employment in a steady state economy. And I see, Warren talks about transition jobs. I like that term, but for me, transition job means the job guarantee, thanks, is about you transitioning, me transitioning, us all transitioning to a steady state economy, while ensuring that people have economic security and a decent standard of life, and dealing with those other issues, like those massively overpaid guys, some of whom I trained in Wall Street, but not just them. They're difficult conversations to be had. Sometimes we sound as though we're saying, we can spend on this, we can spend on that, there's no pain for anyone. And we don't need to tax people more. Well, we don't need to tax people to pay for the things that we want the government to do, but we need to find some way, either via the tax system or some other way, of limiting maximum incomes in the future. And if that sounds a difficult thing to do, I think that's the same thing as saying we need to save our civilization, and we've got maybe 20 or 30 years to do it. And that's
Thanks, and thanks to all of you for these presentations. And I think this is a very interesting conference, and I think I don't disagree with it. Oh yeah, I'm Mark Weisbrot. I'm sorry for the. I'm a co-director and co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and you can find a lot of detail on anything that I'm going to say in these few minutes on our website. We have a lot of papers on various countries. I'll mention a few of them if I have a couple minutes.
So break your ear.
Yeah.
So I agree completely with Stephen about the rich countries really don't need to become richer. They just mostly need to redistribute income. And employment is much more important. As you said, we may have to grow some to get to full employment. I mean, Sweden hit, that they ran about 1.8% unemployment in the late 90s, and they didn't really need to. They just needed to keep that employment level, and with the income distribution and the social safety net that they had, that was a pretty good life. And I think that for most of the women. So I think that's true. I think the relationship between growth and poverty and the things that the social inclusion and the things that we care about is complicated. I think part of what I would interpret what you're saying, we have to also break down that relationship. It's true. It's more related than it should be. So, for example, even in the poorest countries, we do these papers every 5 years on it's called the scorecard of development. We look at all the social indicators and the rate of growth. And over the long term, there's a very high correlation between the rate of economic growth per person and the living standards. And it doesn't always work out that way. But over the long term, there really is, and especially in developing countries. But it doesn't have to be as close as it is. And people, even conservative economists like Angus Stephen have written about that. And so, in other words, some of the most important public health measures that you can take to improve social indicators like expectancy and mortality are not that expensive. But it so happens the social systems are arranged that you have to have a lot of growth for the government to actually do these things. That doesn't have to be as much as it is. Now, having said all that, I do think that what happened in Latin America in the first decade of the 20th century is very important, because you had an economic failure, and it was primarily a growth failure. And by the way, growth is a combination of productivity and population growth, and we can get into that. So, maybe we differ a little on this. I think a lot of growth that is productivity growth is not environmentally destructive. Some of it could be very could reduce carbon emissions, for example, if people traveled less and used the video conferencing that we now have, and a lot of other things like that could actually reduce carbon emissions. But all that being said, you had this terrible failure where, this is very unusual in the history of capitalism, where for 20 years from 1980 to 2000 you had almost no growth of income per person, it was about 5% for the whole period, as opposed to 90% over the previous 20 years from 1960 to 1980. And that's why you had all these elections in where left governments won: Brazil, and Venezuela, and Argentina, and Ecuador, and Paraguay, and other countries. And so that was important. And these left governments succeeded. I think this is something that should be of interest to everybody, and it's almost never discussed here, because this is the empire, and all the media hates all of these governments and has generally supported, efforts to get rid of them, which has been the consistent foreign policy of both the Bush and the Obama administrations, and also, of course, Trump, always with a little more violent threats, but very similar. And so this is something that I think should be important to everybody, because, this was real economic change, and it was done overwhelmingly through the ballot box. The other development successes that you have in the history of the 20th century were not really democratic governments, like China, Taiwan, and South Korea for the first couple of decades at least. And this was really an attempt to do this. And they did succeed. I mean, in the region, they reduced poverty from 2003 to about 2013. They reduced poverty from 44 to 20% in the region. And I could, spend hours looking at all the policies that did it, but I want to focus just a minute on the macro policy, because that's what this conference is about. And, the economic failure of the 80s and 90s had a lot to do with macroeconomic policy. They had other failures. They got rid of development strategy altogether. There's a whole set of neoliberal policies that led to these failure. But in the one decade or so that the left governments had, they were able to reverse some of the macro policies too. One reason they got rid of the IMF. The IMF is the major influence of the U.S. government on low and middle income countries, even more than the CIA probably, in terms of its influence on economic policies. And then they changed some of their macro policies to allow for a lot of positive things. So you had, Brazil by 2014 under the Workers' Party had reduced poverty by 55%, extreme poverty by 65%. And then they made mistakes after that. You had a recession in 2015. The right was able to take advantage of that to pull off a parliamentary coup against Dilma and then throw Lula in jail. And now we have an election coming up where I think that's probably going to be reversed, very hopefully and very likely. But these are the kind of struggles. And I'll say at the end, I'm going to say something about the U.S. role, because the United States government was involved in almost all of these countries and actually succeeded in toppling a couple of governments. But the macro policy was important. I want to mention Ecuador because they're the most, I think, consistently successful under Correa for the decade that he was there. It's not coincidental that he is an economist. That helps. People don't realize it. I mean, Lula's first finance minister was a medical doctor, didn't know anything. And so his idea was just to see what the financial sector wants to do, and I'll do that. And that really does matter. It's not all just, the left tends to focus on corporate interest and all kinds of evil people, but misunderstandings and the lack of knowledge play an important role. And so the Correa government made what to me is most interesting, and Carla, I think you would like some of this because they expanded the whole cooperative sector as well. What's that?
I'm from Brazil.
Okay, yeah. Well, the Workers' Party didn't do as much of that, but they did. They did their anti-poverty programs. They expanded the wholesale community program. They expanded those programs. It was mostly the economic growth, though, that lowered unemployment to 4.9% by 2014, which was a record low. And most of their achievements were basically reversing slightly some of the failed macro policies of the past. But just to get back to Ecuador for a couple minutes, people don't know about this, they've made a lot of major institutional change to be able to do what they do. The first thing they did was to take control of the central bank. Of course, that's blasphemy and heresy, according to the whole economics profession and the business press. It's supposed to be supposedly independent, which means it belongs to the financial sector. So they took that over, and they were able to have lower real interest rates as a result of that, and they also, this is important because there's this myth that globalization prevents anybody from doing anything, but they were actually able to force their banks to have a domestic liquidity requirement, which was 40%, and they raised it to 60%, and then it went to 80%, and so they forced them to keep the dollars at home, and that was really important because I think, and I don't know if Yvonne would agree with this, but the foreign exchange, well, actually it does fit in what you said because they didn't have their own currency, so they weren't monetarily sovereign, but they had the dollar, and so they were really constrained. And so they had to get around this, and they did some really creative things, and one of them was to force the banks to keep their money at home, to tax capital. They got $1 billion from that through taxing capital flight that was leaving the country. They did quantitative easing. How about that? I never thought a country could do that when they didn't even have their own currency, but you can actually do some of it as long as you don't completely break the adoption of the currency. So they did some of that, and they did one of the most innovative things that I hope more governments will do, which was they invoked the WTO's balance of payment safeguards mechanism, which probably nobody here has ever heard of, and nobody's used it really, except for them. And basically it says you can put tariffs on all kinds of things if you're facing a balance of payments crisis. And they did that. And we estimated that saved them about 7.6% of GDP in 2015 and 16, which was massive and prevented them from having a terrible recession as a result of enormous economic shocks, including the collapse of oil prices and the collapse of remittances from abroad, which they were heavily dependent on. So that's just a couple of examples of all these things that they did. I can go into a lot more, but I wanted to emphasize what they were able to do, and then, you know, if people want to know about how things went wrong, I can talk about that. And also, if we want to talk about, since it's related to these macro policies, and another huge, much bigger geographically area is Europe, the failures of the Eurozone, which is another example of how really bad monetary and fiscal policy can create a terrible mess. Okay, thanks.
As I mentioned, we're going to try to have maybe 15 minutes or so of questions and crosstalk among the panelists, and then open up to the whole room. And the question I'm asking myself here, I always ask, is what is the conversation that only the people in this room can have? What is the conversation that only these 4 panelists can have? Because people are coming at it from clearly a variety of different perspectives or focuses, but there's a thread that I was seeing through the different presentations. So if I could just speak to them in a little bit of a scrambled order. We had Carla speaking of the need to understand MMT domestically here in the United States in order to rise to the challenge of the climate crisis, both from a perspective of supply and demand in our energy system. And then we have Stephen speaking, expanding that to a global scale, speaking of the necessity for human survival and the scale and transnationalism of the change, the need to do that everywhere. And then Yvonne's presentation actually drew us to the question of resource flows very explicitly, which becomes highly relevant when we're thinking about implementing policy to save the planet in any country. We clearly need to be looking at it from a global scale or not at all. And then Mark evidently has a wide range of examples of how this has gone well and poorly, both from just purely economic standpoint, but also from an ecological standpoint in a variety of countries. And so with all of that in mind, I guess I just turn the floor over to you all, and I ask, do any of you have questions for each other that could help draw out those threads or help each of you in your work as we try to pull this together? Anyway.
Okay, so, well, the actual question, well, the most relevant question, or that tries to my mind is the following. Look, if you do a serious national investment policy, industrial policy, urban policy, in order to target energy structure, energy and all environmental issues, you are actually, increasing the GDP like crazy. If you make an investment in order to make all the houses of a country energy free, okay, so that they don't need actually any outside energy coming in, they can be somehow autonomous energetically. Or you create you make new plants for free energy and let's say very clean energy. Well, all those things actually increase the GDP like crazy. So I think that a little bit you are constraining yourself a little bit too much when you link so closely the increase of resources use and increase of GDP. Actually, if you want to transition to this world in which that actually I think that there's so much work to do that the GDP goes skyrocket. So
maybe it's the wrong measure.
Well, that's not a question.
Yeah. So where am I wrong?
Well, I think we should be. There's only 10 minutes at the beginning, so you've quite differently said. I think we need to build an economy which is agnostic about GDP, and almost the same way that in MMT we say the fiscal balance. Measure it. Okay. It doesn't matter. Taken out of context of the economy. I feel the same thing about GDP too. But I've got a question for you. Do you think the US economy can grow at 3% per annum forever?
Absolutely. In average.
Okay. That means in 100 years' time, the American economy will be 20 times as large as it currently is. In 200 years' time, 170 times as large as it currently is. And you cannot. That is not consistent. That is not consistent with not using up non-renewable assets. It's not consistent with using up renewable assets at a rate which is necessary to maintain them, and we don't have a way of dealing with the waste. And I just don't believe that. So, yeah, I said, I agree, in the short run, there are lots of wonderful things that we should go ahead and do. We should not do them, because GDP is going to grow, but GDP growth shouldn't be the target. And one, I'll be controversial. The economists I respect most in the world, the only time I ever take a step back and think, I'm not sure, is when they talk about the costs of 2009, the Great Recession, in terms of the loss in GDP. When you see a chart where you've got the upward movement, if I had the slides I could show you, in US real GDP, and then you've got the Great Recession, and it goes down, and it starts rising again, but not on the same trend. How many times have we seen people talking about what is sort of an integral area in between that trend,
the GDP
and what's that, as though it was the cost of the recession? Well, my message is actually there are benefits from GDP growth, but there are also costs. And potentially the costs of limitless GDP growth. GDP, real GDP is supposed to be a sort of measure of quantity. And when you argue that real GDP can grow forever, to channel Herman Daly a bit, the ecological economist, you're arguing that something physical can grow limitlessly on a limited planet.
No, because the GDP is not material related necessarily. If I do a lecture of MMT and I'm paid for that, this is...
What you're going to spend it on?
What?
What you're going to spend it on?
Well, maybe I take a...
Nobody can force you not to spend it on a new car.
You have to eat, you have to wear clothes.
You
have to get from A to B. That will use material energy.
I would agree with you if the other elephant in the room, which Mark raised, and which I didn't dare raise, I don't have an answer for. But these issues would not be a problem if the world population was the same size that it was when I was born.
I totally agree with that. I mean, that's an issue.
Well, that's a huge issue that we all have to get on. I mean, there's sustainability on a wide variety of planes of view, and one of them is there are just too goddamn many of us. You know, you just have to be caught in traffic to realize the congestion. You know, you're all in my way. I love you all very much, except when we're in traffic and I got to get from point A to point B, and you're all in my way, and that's the only reason there's a traffic jam. And every time we expand the highway,
I'm focusing on population, but can I just?
but that contains.
Hold on. I want to hear Yvonne here with the question being, the question was, can we force you not to spend it on a new car? I think you said
yes, there is taxation, you know. If there is some behavior which are socially costly, you can tax them. And you can promote also a consumption behavior that goes in a sustainable way. Taxation actually as the main role is, of course, create salary in a currency, and the other one is to, let's say, shape the behavior of people. So yes, you can do it, and you can do it a lot.
So far, there's no sign of it being done. If you look at the charts, there is no sign of decoupling at all.
The countries with the highest percentage of services as a percentage of GDP in the world have the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions, highest energy consumption, highest material use in the world. There's no sign that transitioning from, and the reason being is this notion that services are resource free. There are three sectors in the economy. There's the primary, secondary and the tertiary sector. When we talk about services, we're talking about the tertiary sector. The output of the secondary sector is the input of the tertiary sector. There is no movement away from the secondary sector to the tertiary sector. So the resources and the material and energy resources used to produce the goods in the secondary sector, which become inputs to the tertiary sector, are indirect resource inputs to that particular sector. There is no way you can change the composition of your output in a way that can reduce the environmental impact and resource intensity of economic activity, but there is no sign that that is happening, and there is no way, given the rate at which gross world product is growing and the rate at which the ecological footprint is growing. We've now got an ecological footprint that is now means that in order to sustain the level of resource consumption and waste that we're generating on a sustainable basis, we need 1.7 planets. And there's no sign of it declining despite a lot of resource-saving technological progress, and that's because the scale of economic activity is overwhelming the efficiency improvement through technological progress.
So before we continue, let's see if the other two panelists have anything to add, and then open it up and just take questions in order, okay?
I think the GDP conversation is actually very interesting and a sustainable panel, just because if we have a measure that hurricanes are actually increasing GDP, GDP cannot be a measure of public policy. I don't know what is the name we can still call it GDP, but we need to have different indicators to measure what it is. And we can go into this growth debate, like let's move to service to use natural resources, but is that there is a room, let's increase care worker. And this is going to grow GDP. Right now there's this informal GDP that nobody's going to play a role in growing. So.
Yeah, I mean, as a matter of accounting, even GDP, I agree with you too. I would prefer to measure social indicators, for example. But, you know, just as a matter of accounting, I mean, GDP is a combination of productivity increases and increases in the size or the labor force, assuming you're employed. And obviously in the rich countries, you can reduce carbon emissions a lot by having a shorter work week. And that's one way to reduce consumption, right? You take your productivity gains, and we've written papers on this, take your productivity gains like Europe has in the form of vacations and leave and everything else, instead of in higher consumption. Because we've taken ours in the US in terms of higher consumption. We've had almost no reduction in ours compared to Europe. But I do think the population thing you raised is very important, because obviously population growth is labor force growth, again, unless they're all unemployed. And that means, and they're not, you know, in the long run, you know, there's, and so that is, you know, people don't want to talk about it because obviously, you know, there's a lot of racism associated with some of the people who have looked at it as a major problem of the developing world. But I have just two short answers to that. One is, let's reduce the population growth of the rich world, because they're the ones consuming, you know, 30 times as much as somebody in Bangladesh. Okay? And people say, well, you already got declining population growth in Italy and Japan and, you know, the rich countries. And, well, you know, it can decline a lot more. I mean, just imagine everybody stops having babies, all right? It will decline very, very fast, all right? And that is ultimately going to be, I think, a huge part of the solution. In the developing world, too, the answer is much more complex than what people are looking at. Because, you know, as probably a lot of you know, there's something called the demographic transition. And so if you actually have development, you do go from a lower, from a high birth rate and death rate to a lower birth rate and death rate. You do stabilize, and you do get to a lower level. Now, I'm going to have enough time for this in terms of climate, but it is going to be part of the solution. I really believe that. If you look at Africa and the projected population growth, that's going to slow down if they increase their incomes, they have pensions, they have some kind of security. That's going to be part of the solution as well. And if I could just mention one other thing that, because, you know, if you're talking about the real impacts on climate change, there's some studies indicating, and they're fairly good in my opinion, that the, you know, animal agriculture is larger in its contribution to carbon emissions than the entire transportation sector. And nobody's talking about that, you know. And why, you know, so, yeah,
not enough.
Yeah, just not the major environmental groups or anybody that you hear in the media. And I'm just mentioning that because it shows how the debate is really shaped by people's values and of course, powerful interests.
So we had a lot of energy in the thread around GDP, decoupling, alternate measures of prosperity, this whole thing. That's one place we could go as we open up to the audience. I know there were people trying to get in on that spot.
There's a lot of questions, I guess.
Can I offer a potential clarifying framework here between because we're talking about
Get in the microphone.
Can we take questions and go around? There's a lot of people
Pass the microphone.
that want to get in the
Yeah, we need to be passing the microphone as well. Let's hear some questions and then we'll go around.
Yeah, and I think that Steve, you were.
Pass this around.
Yeah, I think that Steve was first, or I don't.
Can we just pass around?
Let's just gather a couple of questions, like 3 questions and an answer. So then you can go ahead and then you can go.
Okay, raise your hand if you want to go and we'll get your name.
So my question, I didn't really understand why it was not possible to dematerialize the GDP. Like, I'd like to understand why is it not possible, like if people are consuming guitar lessons and, you know, belly dance lessons and whatnot, then you have like a dematerialized GDP. So you think that that GDP necessarily involves like uses of the non-renewable resources, and that's my question.
Steve?
My concern is that you know, we have an artificial scarcity based on the currency today, but by imposing another form of austerity in terms of a resource austerity, how do we effectively ensure that resources are distributed in a more equitable fashion, as we see the currency already is not distributed in an equitable fashion? That would be my question.
Again, about population and consumption. You know, I remember living in Burlington, Vermont, and seeing several fields right outside Burlington, Vermont. And at that point in my early 20s, I was already looking at a beautiful field like that and thinking, that's not going to last. You know, that's going to be a strip mall one day. I remember, you know, watching movies, you know, like Back to the Future. They go back in time, and, you know, I remember this used to all be fields as far as you can see, and there's no hint of that anymore in that present scenario. So to me, population, consumption, you know, these are all linked. And what I think about when I think about these things is, if we're not going to do anything drastic like sterilization or anything draconian like that, if we need to start convincing a population to conserve and to change their ways and to stop consuming, I think, you know, one of the things we want to talk about is how do we get the people to a place where they're not feeling so economically desperate, so squeezed, and so freaked out, you know, that they can actually stop and think and listen to a solution and implement it.
Can you pass it over there, and then after that, let's go back for like answers and try and keep the answers short and the questions short. There's a lot of questions in the room.
Sure. So on the subject of sort of like decreasing economic growth, I'd like to bring up Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. I mentioned it yesterday. And I have this sense that like human beings have this tendency to get, like in our economy, to get sucked into these like very resource intensive, destructive kind of games that don't need to be played. So for example, the military, Bitcoin, Wall Street, much of the US healthcare industry, sort of parts of the legal sector, like you could simply sort of like delete these things and we would be no worse off, probably better off. We could just make them all gym teachers or something. It would be better. So how do we build an economic system which has a sort of has a sort of immune system which kind of identifies these sort of games that arise that could sort of be like like killed by like an immune system cell that like removes this unnecessary economic activity and replaces it with something more productive.
So let's go back for really quick answers from the panel so we can take more questions afterwards.
Yeah. So the guitar lessons, I like it. But you see what you're actually saying, I think, is they're going to, the people that are taking guitar lessons are not working and producing goods and services when they're doing that. So you're basically making an argument, this is good. I think that's good, actually, even in a rich country, because, you know, we don't need to produce more. We need to have everybody have a decent life. We need to change people's habits so that's possible, and we need to change the system. I mean, you know, at a deeper level, we don't have time to talk about it. You know, capitalism itself is based on expansion, as we all know, and it's also, but it doesn't just expand production, it expands people's needs. It creates new needs constantly and then satisfies them, and these needs become part of people's identities. And that's what makes it so hard. You really have to change the culture of the society as well. But that's what I think you're talking about. And yeah, the bullshit job, I think, you know, you did a reorganization of the economy and the society. You need I mean, in the best case scenario, which we're probably, you know, many decades away from, you have planning.
I can add just to the consumerism question. I think, as I tried to point it out, MMT should not only do the good, but we need to end the bad. Yes. And I think consumerism is basically the logic that corporate power is being able to enable this system. Like, should we have ads on television that are promoting kids to buy more toys in the United States? So I think there's the cultural value, I think, but I think we need to find ways that MMT can also kind of disengage with what we think is bad as well. I come from my perspective, but I think we all can think in many ways that plays out in other fields.
I think guitar lessons are great for a steady state economy because there's no way you're going to get economic growth based on guitar lessons. There's no scope for productivity growth at all, as far as guitar lessons are concerned. So that's marvellous. That would be my vision of the future for the US is that people have guaranteed employment at a minimum wage, somewhat like the minimum wage in Australia, which is much higher, even though our GDP per capita is much lower than your national minimum wage. I think that when people have economic security, you do valuable tasks, and there's been a lot written about the kinds of jobs that people do in a job guarantee scheme, which would help to maintain and defend the natural environment, or at least do much less damage to it. You can get rid of what is a national disease in the US, which is bullshit jobs. I have seen people work, I've talked to people here who've got 3 jobs, who are working for a wage which would be illegal in the country that I come from, far from being legal. Last year I had a taxi driver in Kansas City who had never earned the Australian minimum wage in the richest country in the world. And that's shameful. So that's where politicians like some of you are activists. I think pushing for $16 an hour at least. Once people have that economic security, then the bullshit jobs, they don't need to do the bullshit jobs. And secondly, it's also much easier from them to start talking to people about true to working with weeks when they know they have economic security. At the moment, people are working like mad because they don't know they're going to lose their job next year. What are they going to do? If they knew that there was a decent basic income available to them and all the non-pecuniary benefits of employment, it just changed the conversation. It will make these issues much easier to deal with. Final thing, Bill who interjected is a pioneer in the development of something called the Genuine Progress Indicator, which I strongly recommend everybody to learn about, because although I don't necessarily believe in a single measure of sustainable economic progress, it's not really that. It's a combination of economic and social and environmental factors summarised in one statistic. And if we've got to target something, that's what I target.
Thank you. let me say this. I see capitalism as an epiphenomena of the state, in the sense that capitalism is grounded on preconditions of the state, which is currency and property right. It's property right that make the demarcation between socialism, capitalism, slavery, and schiavismo. So basically the state has the power to shape the evolution of capitalism. So capitalism doesn't have its own, let's say, natural power, autonomous from state. And we can have a capitalism which is more like Norway, okay, or a capitalism which is more like, I don't know, Vietnam. And I think if you take the direction of a capitalism like Norway, we can absolutely get closer to the kind of economics that you were referring about. Then I would like to answer to the mythological real progressive guy that I always saw on social media. So basically, in all this conversation, and generally speaking in the conference, there is the lack of a central concept. And I think this is because you're American, and and it is a class struggle. Okay? Class struggle, and it's not just about corporations, way more than that. It's about force of relation between who buy labor and who sell labor. And I see job guarantee as a class struggle element, which empower not just who is in the job guarantee, but all labor forces. And this actually then indirectly empowers the middle class. Because if basically a worker has a higher contractual power, then also an architect or an engineer increases his power. So basically this is the way to equity, and it's not just the deficit. You don't do this with the composition of spending or the state. You do this providing a setup in which the class struggle is favoring the working class. Then you don't have to be afraid in promoting an empowerment of the working class. It's not yes, there will be some business that will fail. Yes, there will be somebody who will be damaged by that. Also, in some, let's say, maybe also in some middle size firm. If a firm is middle size, doesn't mean that it's good, you know, automatically. So my answer is shaping capitalism, helping class struggle from the bottom.
Very good. Yeah.
Okay. My name is Michael Hexter. I've written some blog posts over the years that deal with many of the questions that have been asked in the context of an MMT economic perspective. Not all of them, and it won't be to everyone's satisfaction. But anyway, if you go to New Economic Perspectives and Michael Hoexter, you will see at least my attempts to deal with some of these questions. I think there is in this discussion, there is two underlying concepts that are not being, that could be separated out, and then we could have a more productive discussion. One of them is an equilibrium approach to economics. The other one is a disequilibrium or change approach. In other words, what is our transition? What are we transitioning to? And I think it becomes very, very clear in terms of climate change, which I think is a crisis. And it's not a matter of 20 or 30 years, it's a matter of this year, next year, and the year after. The steps are very clear in terms of what we should be doing to transition. And some of that has to do with planning. This gets to sort of a second, planning is a bad word in economics. It's considered to be communistic, so forth and so on, but it's not discussed enough, it's not taken seriously enough, it's not put on in the framework also with an MMT that it should be, because I think that basically we need to be doing a lot more planning in terms of our energy use, in terms of our use of the food system, our waste, so forth and so on. And that involves a different kind of discussion. So I think both separating out equilibrium and disequilibrium concepts is a good idea to make the discussion more productive, rather than saying we should be targeting in 30 years a society with negative growth or zero growth or whatever it is, or we should be rapidly moving right now, which would create, as Ivan has said, lots of GDP. The transition will be a huge economic boom at the same time that we will be destroying destroying aspects of the economy through taxation that are destructive to our common well-being.
Questions on this side? Yeah, more people.
Oh.
So, okay,
Stand up for a long time.
Right here, this gentleman in the corner.
Yeah, so then, okay, let's go here, her, and him, you four, and then answer, okay?
Thank you.
So this matter we're here talking about guitar lessons, and Steve, you replied saying that you don't believe guitar lessons could be a source of growth because there's no room for productivity growth, but we still have a growing population, so we can have more guitar lessons. Now, obviously, the question of the inputs to the guitar lessons that you referred to over there, the wood and the guitar and steel and the strings and all those other inputs, and there could be a sustainability problem there. But then I think for that we need to be talking more about the circular economy and how we can get more out of the resources we're using. Now, that's going to have a GDP component. As these resources circulate through the economy more times than they are currently, which is very few right now since we have a very linear production process and this waste disposal process, there's going to be GDP being produced. So I think we need to move more towards that kind of framing than this reduction of consumption, because I don't see any future where we really are going to convince people to change their behavior, and to be completely frank, at least in countries like the United States.
I think we will. I think they'll be forced to.
Well, maybe they'll be forced to, but maybe
Mother
we'll
Nature will have the last word.
So I wanted to get a response to that.
Yeah, okay, so we can just have her and him and then go to the responses, okay?
I'm not going to talk about GDP. So I think going off of what Stephen said, I really liked your point about how climate change is never a central issue at any of these conferences. And I think that it's really important that it's addressed that climate change, jobs, housing, all of these issues, social justice, have to be solved together, because they are separate, but they're kept separate, but they can only be solved if all of them are solved. And so I think that climate change solutions are seen to be effective largely in communities in the global south. I've done a lot of research on that, and that's because those are the people who are feeling the effects of climate change, right? We're all here in America, we're all living our middle class lives, or 1% lives.
I don't really know it.
Okay, well, you know what I mean. Whatever. We're living your middle class life, I'm sure.
All the world is America.
And so we don't have to face these challenges every day. We aren't forced to come up with these solutions. And so I think that, look around the room. Who's in here? Men, mostly white. Okay, there's like 4 or 5 women, only 2 of color maybe. And I think that it's important to make this conversation accessible to these marginalized communities and these communities who have the solutions. Right? We have to make this conversation accessible to the people who have the solutions and have this knowledge but aren't given the access to give the knowledge. Okay, now second point, real quick. I wrote a paper on, I'm really interested in natural resource valuation, and wrote a paper on Polanyi and his idea of fictitious commodities, and how natural resources are fictitious commodities because they're not made to be bought or sold. And so I'm just wondering, and I argue that we have ineffective valuation because we're trying to work within this framework that where we can't effectively evaluate them. And so I'm just wondering if you have an idea of how we can shift valuation of natural resources to reduce use, but also ensure climate justice, so that we're not, leaving behind those communities who have limited access. So it's not just, making sure that the rich have access, because that's all they're gonna care about when.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Yep. I can build on that a little bit. I'm a big mouth, I probably don't need that, but thank you. My name is Jason Funke, I'm a geographer by training. Carl Polanyi did talk about 3 essential fictitious commodities that separated capitalist market societies from anything that previously had existed. Now is the commodification of land, labor, and money. What MMT has done brilliantly is eviscerate the idea that money is a public or private commodity. Okay? And it's beginning to, through the job guarantee, to actually begin to go after the notion of labor as a private commodity as well. But it's ignored private property, which is the essential component of commodifying nature, okay, and land. Now, today, China, the BRICS, the Gulf states, and public money and their sovereign wealth funds are going out and buying up land grabs across the global south. They're in a process of a massive infrastructure boom, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has tremendous environmental repercussions. So it's not just the industrial rich countries that are doing this. In fact, it's the fact that there's a middle group of countries that are trying to live the lifestyle, the living standards of the developed economies. And they're beginning to catch up, and that's where population comes in really importantly. So what MMT has done well, as I understand it, is to begin to go after the private commodification of these three fictitious commodities, except for the last one. And I was hoping that somebody, and I may be my own ignorance about the MMT work that's out there, the body's growing. So if there is something in that regard, I would love to hear about that.
So let's just go back on answers. We can take another round, hopefully we keep it short.
Okay. Well, is that
Okay.
Okay, I would go this way. That's fine. So yeah, I like the intervention. I want to just respond to simpler things and keep it short. But it's very good. I don't think there's that much disagreement here. I think we all agree, first of all, that in the short run, it is hard to change habits of consumption and all that. Although some things can change it quite drastically. Like, for example, when you have shorter work hours, that's big. I mean, Norwegians spend 300 hours a year with their children, okay? And that could happen here too. So work hours is, we did a paper on work hours, one of the first ones, on climate, and it showed that if the U.S. and these other countries you're talking about that are getting to European living standards adopted European work hours, the effect on climate change would be like a degree or a degree and a half Celsius, okay? So it's huge, if you get people to do this, and it can be done, it's already done in a huge part of the world. So it can be, so it's got to be the U.S., which is still the, well, it's not really the largest economy anymore, but it's close to it. And it also has to be these other countries that are trying to achieve U.S. living standards. Are they going to go to the U.S. way, or are they going to go the European? That's enormous right there, okay? And it's not enough, but it's very big. And the second thing is the birth rate in the U.S. has plummeted since the Great Recession. Nobody knows exactly why. These things are often very hard to explain, but there's a long way to go with that. As I said, you can have negative population growth, and it can be really negative, okay? And the things that promote that are generally empowerment of women, access to birth control, and things that, and development, all those things lower the birth rate. Those are all things we want. So, that should be on the agenda.
If you have a desire to volunteer, you want to learn some skills, don't think you're walking into Microsoft. We're not Microsoft. We're just a bunch of volunteers trying to put this thing together, but we do have a plan. And if you're interested in learning, you're interested in contributing, and you're interested in being a part of something greater than yourself, that's not just politically driven, that is beyond politics, it's over politics, it's broader. If you want to be a part of something like that, we want you to be a part of us too. Make no mistake about it. We are all about modern monetary theory, and we're proud as hell of it. We don't pull punches, we don't make excuses, and we don't provide air cover for people that get the economics wrong. But the rest of it, we go hand in hand with almost everyone when it comes to the progressive movement's desire for green energy, when it comes to the progressive movement's desire for healthcare, when it comes to education, all the above. So think about it. We could use your money for sure. If you would like to help us on a monthly basis, please go to our Patreon account. if you want to send a check, we have a P.O. box now, P.O. Box 313, Lewisberry, Pennsylvania, 17339. We have our Patreon account, like I said, for monthly donations. And we also have a PayPal for one-time donations. I'm hoping that if you volunteer, you'll look at the button on our page, the page that's associated with this live stream, and you'll click on that button and you'll sign up to volunteer. If you've got video editing skills, if you've got writing skills, if you've got project management skills, if you've got business analyst skills, if you've got process management skills, if you've got a desire to be a part of something and are willing to learn and have no skills, but willingness, please click that button and sign up. And if you just want to know what's going on, go ahead and sign up so we can get our newsletter out to you as well. But in the meantime, though, I just want you to know I appreciate every one of you for supporting us, even watching these live streams, coming to our page, sharing our content. We are going to change the world. I assure you that, one way or the other. And I hope you all will be a part of that. I'm Steve Grumbine with Real Progressives. Have a great evening, everyone.